Many workplaces contain confined spaces that can present real or potential dangers to employees who must enter the space for work purposes. This program will assist employers and employees in understanding the requirements for practices and procedures to protect employees in general industry from the hazards of entry into permit-required confined spaces. The overview of this instructional video will cover what is a confined space, hazards of a confined space, training, permit-required confined space program, emergency rescue, and personal protective equipment, or PPE. OSHA's Standard 1910.146 Permit-Required Confined Spaces defines a confined space as an area large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter and perform assigned work, has limited or restricted means for entry or exit, and is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. A confined space is not limited to small areas, such as manholes and ditches, but includes larger areas, such as tanks, vessels, and silos. Working within a confined space requires a permit if the area has the potential as being a serious safety or health hazard. It is the employer's responsibility to evaluate workspaces to determine if it is a permit-required confined space, PRCS. If a confined space is designated as PRCS, then it is up to the employer to inform its employees by posting danger signs or by other equally effective means of notification. The employer must also take steps in preventing its employees from entering the space until a written permit space program is produced. The permit program must be available at the time of entry to all authorized entrants or their authorized representatives by posting it at the entry portal or by any other effective means. The entrants can therefore confirm that pre-entry preparations have been completed. Before an employer can enter a permit space, the internal atmosphere must be tested with an instrument that detects oxygen content, flammable gases and vapors, and potential toxic air contaminants. Employers are also required to define hazards in permit spaces, have confined space entry protocol and a written permit program, train and equip employees to complete tasks in particular permit spaces, only allow authorized entrants into the permit space, and appoint employees, attendants, to monitor permit spaces and enforce entry rules. An attendant is an individual stationed outside one or more permit spaces, whose job it is to monitor authorized entrants, as well as perform all attendant duties assigned in the employer's permit space program. Confined spaces can possess many hazards. Permit-required confined space means a confined space has one or more of the following characteristics: hazardous atmosphere, engulfing potential, trapping or asphyxiation configuration, other recognized serious safety hazards. The atmosphere of a confined space can be hazardous. The atmosphere can prevent escape without help and cause illness or even death. There are three types of hazardous atmospheres: oxygen deficient, flammable, and toxic. Oxygen deficiency is the atmosphere having less than normal percentage of oxygen found in normal air. Oxygen is safe when it is between 19.5% and 23.5%. When the level of oxygen falls to 16%, judgment and coordination suffer and difficulty breathing and drowsiness occur. At 12%, a person becomes unconscious, and death occurs at 6%. The level of oxygen can fall if the space contains iron, which uses oxygen to form rust. methane, which pushes oxygen out of an area, and carbon dioxide, which absorbs oxygen. Never enter a confined space unless the oxygen in that space is sufficient. If entrance into an oxygen-deficient space is required, wear a supplied air respirator to provide fresh air. Confined spaces may often contain gases, vapors, mists, or dusts that are flammable. The risks of a fire may not be obvious, and only testing can show if it contains traces of flammable substances. Substances in the air can be ignited by smoking, grinding or welding, unapproved electrical equipment, or any kind of metal friction. Inhalation of the atmosphere can be toxic. If a substance exceeds its permissible exposure limit, it could cause illness or death. Inhaling just a little of some substances can cause irritation to the respiratory or nervous system. Such toxins include carbon monoxide, which replaces the oxygen in the blood and can cause death. Hydrogen sulfide can cut off breathing. It can be easily detected by its rotten egg smell. And sulfur dioxide is very poisonous, even in small amounts. Dizziness, drowsiness, nausea, or headaches are good signs that the confined space should be evacuated immediately. Another hazard a confined space may have is the potential for engulfment. This happens when an employee is trapped, buried, or smothered by liquid or flowing solids, such as grain or sand. Even if the material doesn't cover the head, the pressure on the chest can be enough to prevent breathing or damage internal organs. Some confined spaces have an entrapping design. Employees can be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a smaller cross-section. Confined spaces may also contain physical hazards, such as moving machinery parts, buildup of heat, falls from entry or exit ladders, noise from machinery, and electrocution from live wires. Employee training is a very important part of safety in confined spaces. It is up to each employer to maintain a safe working environment. Each employer's permit-required confined space safety program must ensure that all authorized entrants know the hazards of the confined space they are about to enter, use proper equipment, communicate with the attendant as necessary, and alert them whenever a potential dangerous situation or prohibited condition arises, and exit from the permit space as quickly as possible when required. OSHA requires employers to provide training before assigning duties to employees pertaining to permit spaces, before changing employees' duties, when the procedures change for the permit space, or when it is evident that an employee needs additional training. Authorized entrants, attendants, and entry supervisors should fully understand the signs, symptoms, and the resulting dangers of hazards in the confined space, procedures for entry into permit spaces, how to communicate with each other during occupancy of permit space, as well as rescue procedures, and how to be safe in a confined space. OSHA requires a written entry permit program be developed and implemented by the company before entering a permit-required confined space. The program should be available for inspection by employees and their authorized representatives. Employers must implement necessary measures to prevent unauthorized entry, identify and evaluate hazards of the permit space, develop and implement procedures and practices necessary for safe permit space entry operations, including, but not limited to, specifying acceptable entry conditions, provide opportunity to observe any monitoring or testing of permit spaces to authorized entrants, isolate the permit space, eliminate or control atmospheric hazards, provide barriers as necessary to protect entrants from external hazards, and verify that conditions in the permit space are acceptable for entry throughout the duration of an authorized entry. Employers must provide and maintain all equipment for safe entry into and rescue from permit spaces. All employees must be trained in the proper use of all the following equipment: testing and monitoring equipment needed to comply with the OSHA standard, ventilating equipment to obtain acceptable entry conditions, communications equipment, PPE, lighting equipment to see well enough to work safely and to exit the space quickly in the event of an emergency, equipment needed to enter and exit space, rescue and emergency equipment, and any other equipment needed for safe entry into and rescue from permit spaces. Additionally, employers should test the conditions in the permit space to determine if acceptable entry conditions exist before entry is authorized to begin. Test or monitor the permit space as necessary to determine if acceptable entry conditions are being maintained during the course of operations. When testing for atmospheric hazards, test first for oxygen, then combustible gases and vapors, followed by toxic gases and vapors. Employers must provide authorized entrant the opportunity to observe the pre-entry and subsequent testing or monitoring of permit spaces. Employers must also reevaluate the permit space in presence of any authorized entrant who requests reevaluation. This is done because the entrant has reason to believe that the evaluation of that space may not have been adequate. Employers should immediately provide each authorized entrant with the results of any testing conducted in accordance to the OSHA standard. Employers need to provide at least one attendant outside the permit space into which entry is authorized for the duration of the entry operations. If attendant is monitoring more than one space, employers must include in the permit the means and procedures to enable the attendant to respond to an emergency affecting one or more of the monitored spaces. The company needs to designate persons who have active roles in entry operations. The duties for each of these employees must be identified and training must be provided. They must also develop and implement procedures for summoning rescue and emergency services. The employer must develop and implement systems for the preparation, issuance, and use and cancellation of entry permits. Review entry operations when the employer has reason to believe that the measures taken under the permit space program may not protect employees. Revise the program to correct deficiencies found to exist before subsequent entries are authorized. And finally, permits must be kept on file and used to review the program within 1 year of the permit entry and revise the program as necessary to ensure that employees participating in entry operations are protected from permit space hazards. Employers may perform a single annual review covering all entries performed during a 12-month period. Employers must post an entry permit at the entrance of a permit-required confined space. It is important for the authorized entrant, attendant, and entry supervisor to read the permit before working in or around the space. The permit must contain the space to be entered and the purpose, permit date and length of time the permit is valid, the name of the authorized entrant, the personnel serving as attendant and entry supervisor, the hazards of the permit space, the methods used to isolate, eliminate, or control the hazards of the permit space, the acceptable entry conditions, results of initial and periodic tests performed, the rescue services that can be contacted and the means for contacting these services, the methods to maintain communication between the authorized entrant and the attendant, equipment needed to perform the tasks such as PPE, testing equipment, communication equipment, or rescue gear, any other information that is necessary for the circumstances of the confined space, and any additional permits required to perform work in the space, such as welding. Authorized entrants should know the hazards that are present in the workspace, properly use equipment, communicate with the attendant in case of exposure to a hazard, alert the attendant when any warning signs of a dangerous situation or prohibited conditions are recognized, Exit from the permit space when the attendant orders an evacuation of the confined space, any warning signs of a hazard are recognized, a prohibited condition is discovered, and the evacuation alarm is activated. OSHA requires the employer to train all attendants that will be watching over a confined space. Employers should ensure attendants know the hazards of the confined space and the behavioral effects of those hazards, know how many authorized entrants are in a confined space and be able to identify each one, never leave the entrance of the confined space while authorized entrants are inside, monitor and maintain communication with the entrants about the hazards that could be presented inside and outside the space, contact rescue services as soon as they determine that the authorized entrant needs assistance with escaping, warn unauthorized persons to stay clear from the confined space, and advise authorized entrants and entry supervisor if an unauthorized person has entered the permit space, be able to perform non-entry rescues, and do not perform any additional duties that could interfere with the primary duty to monitor and protect the authorized entrant or entrants. There must be an entry supervisor for each permit-required confined space. The entry supervisor can monitor more than one space at a time. The duties of an entry supervisor include knowing the hazards of the confined space, including the mode, symptoms, and consequences of each hazard, verifying that proper entries have been made, as well as all the proper tests have been performed, and that all procedures and equipment required are in place and ready to use, terminating the entry and canceling the permit, removing unauthorized individuals who enter or attempt to enter the restricted space, and determining that entry operations remain consistent with terms of the entry permit and that the acceptable entry conditions are maintained. Employee safety is a major concern during confined space entry. Emergency rescue teams must be available while authorized entrants are in the confined space. The rescue service is to close off the area, get authorized entrants out of the space, and perform first aid when needed. Deaths often occur during rescue situations. Many times, employees attempt to rescue an entrant without the proper training and then get caught themselves in the confined space. It is best to use a retrieval system outside the space to bring the employee out of the space. Authorized entrants should wear harnesses connected to the retrieval line. The retrieval equipment must be in place before employees enter the permit space. One of the most important components of PPE in a confined space is a respirator. The air purifying respirator doesn't deliver fresh air, but purifies the inhaled air from toxic gases and vapors. Supplied air respirators provide air in areas that may have too little oxygen for the brain to function properly. It is important to fit test each piece of PPE. If a respirator is too loose or tight, it may allow toxins to be inhaled. A good fit feels secure around the chin and doesn't pinch the nose. It shouldn't slip and should allow your head to move in all directions. Respirators need to be inspected before each use to make sure that there are no cracks, holes, signs of wear, or loose connections. Respirators should be cleaned after each use. If a respirator is not cleaned or stored properly, it may not be fit to protect the next wearer. Other forms of PPE include hard hats, safety glasses, gloves, safety shoes, and clothing that protects the torso against chemicals, fires, and other hazards. The employer must identify confined spaces that are permit required. They must identify the hazards of the space and post a permit before allowing authorized employees to enter. Permits need to be posted near the entrance of each confined space, displaying the necessary information. Authorized entrants should remember safety training and read the permit before entering the space. Use proper PPE and be alert to potential hazards. Authorized entrants should immediately leave the space if in danger or hear an evacuation alarm. Attendants must understand the dangers in and around the confined space, as well as stay in contact with the authorized entrant and be prepared to order an evacuation and call the rescue team. The entry supervisor needs to ensure that the confined space operations conform to the permit. They should remove unauthorized personnel from the area and keep them from entering the space. Make sure each hazard is identified and controlled before entering a confined space. And emergency rescues should only be made by trained personnel or a rescue service. A proper confined space procedure can save lives and prevent injuries if procedures are followed correctly. Never take shortcuts when it comes to the safety of yourself and others.